So grief is not something that is discussed in Canadian society, and grief education in general is often neglected, and numerous myths exist around grief. Dying with Dignity Canada's mission is, through advocacy, public education, and personal support, DWDC ensures Canadians have access to quality end-of-life choice and care. It can be argued that quality end-of-life care transcends into grief education, as it is something that affects not only the dying person, but the family and friends left behind. Grief literacy is in no way a clinical offering, but instead is one that focuses on public education. I'd now like to invite all of you watching from home to light a candle if you feel called to do so, and if your space allows it, to honor the people we are speaking about and anyone in your own lives whose memory is at top of mind during today's session. My candle light, there we go. Today's topic is a national perspective on grief and how we grieve. And we're joined by Susan Cadell and Katherine Kortes-Miller, who will discuss some of their own research on death, dying, and grief. They will explore the importances of including conversations about grief in public spaces outside of clinical and institutional contexts. Susan is a social worker, researcher, and professor in the School of Social Work at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. Katherine is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work and the associate director of the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health at Lakehead University. She is also the author of Talking About Death Won't Kill You, the Essential Guide to End-of-Life Conversations. I will now hand it over to our presenters, and thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
All right. And you can go ahead and get your presentation up.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan, as you heard, and I'm located in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is the traditional territories of the Arandran, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and I'm situated near the Grand River, which is territories that were promised to the Six Nations and currently do not belong. Most of it does not belong to the Six Nations. So that's where I'm located, and you heard a little bit about me. Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself before we go on and start our presentation?
Thanks, Susan. I'm Kathy Kortes-Miller. I am located on the shore of Lake Superior in the Robinson Treaty at Superior, the land of Fort William First Nations, and it's a privilege to be here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting us. This has been a privilege to think about and pull together, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Kathy, because it's just been, I've known about Kathy and her work for a very long time, and it's only been in the last year or so that we've actually started collaborating. So this was a nice opportunity to continue that collaboration and yeah, do some more thinking about that. So today we're talking to you about a national perspective on how we grieve, and there we go. So first, we're going to start off by talking about grief to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I want to declare a personal bias that I am against the idea of stages of grief. I do not believe that there's anything staged or linear about grief. Grief can be messy and very difficult. So I am not a fan of any notion of stages, no matter how many people think there are. So that's my bias. That's where I start. So what is grief? Grief is a full body experience in reaction to loss, not just death-related loss, but that's the kind that we speak most about. And I particularly like this sculpture because it portrays the full body experience and the heaviness of grief, and just sort of the embodiment as well. So that it's a physical, emotional, social experience, and grief encompasses and touches everything. So that's one of the reasons why it's important that we talk about it. So if I don't like stages and we don't like stages, what is it that we're talking about? This is one model that I particularly like about that depicts grief. And I particularly like it for a number of reasons. One is it's complicated. There's nothing linear about it. It is referred to as an attachment model. I call it an oscillation model because of the squiggly line in the middle that demonstrates that people flip back and forth from being oriented towards restoration or sort of normalcy, quote unquote, and being oriented towards the loss. And so we, all of us, because I grieve as well, go back and forth between those two. And within each of those two orientations, there are both positive and negative meanings. So there's a lot of complexity to this model, and yet it's very simple in some ways. So this is the model that I find describes best the experience of grief. The other way that I think about grief is in terms of continuing bonds. We used to talk about grief in the field. Grief used to be talked about as needing to do grief work and the need to detach from the person who died. And in the last couple of decades, the field has turned to the realization that death doesn't end a relationship, death transforms a relationship. And this portrait in front of you is in the Folk Art Museum in New York City. And it's a portrait that enshrines the youngest child who's in the carriage in the family, and in the sibling constellation, because the youngest child died, and the painting was painted either just before or just after the youngest child died. There, it's not clear anymore, but it enshrines the place of that child in that family, and so the other children grow up with that continuing bond with the child through this painting, and as do the parents, of course. So I think it's a lovely representation of this notion of continuing bonds and of learning to be in relationship in a different way when someone has died. So continuing bonds is another way of thinking about grief. And so just to emphasize that grieving does not equal a problem. Grieving is a natural response. And grieving and grief is not a mental health issue. And so it's all part of a normal response. And I'm not that huge a fan of the word normal either, because really, what is normal? But what we're trying to emphasize here is that grief is a natural reaction to a loss of any kind, and especially a loss of someone who's died. So one of the quotes from Colin Murray Parkes, who's a UK psychiatrist who has worked for decades in the field of palliative care and grief and loss, is the idea that grief is the price that we pay for love, that when we love, we will grieve, and that if we don't love, that's the only way of protecting ourselves from grief. And it is just, again, a normal part of, or a natural part of the process. So now let's talk about death, and I'll pass it over to Kathy.
Thank you, Susan. So just as Susan was talking about having the discussions around grief and including them in our day-to-day lives, I wanted for us to position death as a normative life event. And next slide, please, Susan. And so I just want to channel my favorite philosopher, John Cleese, who says, life is a terminal illness which is sexually transmitted. So I'm hoping that many of you have heard that before, because one of the few things that we can count on in our lives is that we will die. And so it makes sense at some point then, if we take death out of the closet and we begin to talk about it, to learn about it and engage with it and recognize the positionality of this important and integral life event, where it fits in with community, with society, and with the systems that we tend to interface with. Next, please, Susan. So perhaps you have heard that there's been a bit of a shift when we're talking about dying and death lately, and it's becoming to be a little bit more around the public health approach to palliative care, which situates dying and death as being everyone's responsibility. And so we used to turn over our dying to our healthcare system. And our healthcare system definitely has its strengths, it has its challenges for sure, but it should not necessarily own our dying, because our healthcare system is driven to fix things. It is driven to extend life. And sometimes we come to a point where we need to recognize that we are going to die. And so thinking about situating death in our community where most of us spend our time becomes really important. Next, please. So if we think about a public health perspective around dying and death, we need to be aware that we're not focused on curing death, but rather thinking about what is it that people need so that they are prepared for this integral event that occurs within all of our lives. So when we think about what we want at the end of life, most of us want to be in community as much as possible. We want to be with our friends, our family, those people who know us and get us. And we recognize that professional care at the end of life tends to be episodic at best. And so we rely on those people who know us and love us and who have traveled with us throughout our life. And so we need to think about this as being a social event, that we need to see dying not so much as a medical event, but rather something that occurs within community. It is holistic and it connects us to those who know and understand us. Next, please. So when we think about adopting a public health focus to grief, to palliative care and end of life, it also highlights grief. And this is something that the majority of the palliative care community will acknowledge, that we have not done a very good job of incorporating grief into the work that we are doing at the end of life. And so Susan's going to talk about grief literacy as we move through as a way to build our capacity to care for each other. And a public health focus of end of life also moves beyond just the individual or the disease, but recognizes the impact that dying has for caregivers. It recognizes that there is an impact on the social services and the networks. And it also provides opportunity for people to become involved, to be able to step up, to be able to use caregiving as a way to connect with people and to feel good about continuing their relationship with a person who is significantly ill or dying. Next, please. So one of the ways that the public health approach to end of life is getting the message out there is by developing compassionate communities. And these are communities that know how to step up for people at a time when they're facing the end of their lives. It acknowledges that dying and death is something that is going to happen to all of us, and that it is more than a medical responsibility, that it involves each and every one of us in our capacity to care for somebody. And it sees dying and death as being an important part of our whole healthcare system and the social and societal responsibilities that we have within that. Next, please. So one of the things that a public health approach focuses on is the idea of death literacy. Now, I remember when my children were growing up, they're now teenagers, but when they entered elementary school, we were talking about math literacy and reading literacy and all these literacies that my children were going to grow up with. But we never really talked about death literacy. It almost seems like we focus on, if you go to a bookstore these days, you will see a bazillion books on parenting, childbirth, but we don't see too many around dying and death. It's almost as if we've forgotten that this is an important part of our life that we need to learn about and figure out how to do this well, because it's a way to honor the people that we love. And so there's some work out of Australia that focuses on measuring the death literacy of communities. And death literacy is the know-how, how to plan well for the end of life. So it thinks about our skills. It thinks about the practical skills. When we think about activities of daily living, what's required to care for somebody in the home as they are entering the end of life? What kind of things have we learned about when we've had experiences of death of people closest to us? And then it also takes a social action piece. And I think Dying with Dignity is a great example of that social action piece, is recognizing what is it that people want at the end of life, and how do we improve our systems that are already in place and build our capacities so that people can die in the way that they would like to. Next, please. So the death literacy that we're hoping to grow with people is to enhance our knowledge about and our understanding about the death system. And the death system are all those pieces that teach us about what dying means. So it can mean from our funeral system, it can mean about the coroner's office, it can mean about our religion, it can think about how is it, are we engaged in this kind of formal education in medical schools, in universities, and it thinks about what do we need to know so that we can step up at the time when we are faced with our own mortality, but also the impending death of those that we love. And so when we think about this and we position it within the context of a public health perspective, it encourages people to make decisions for themselves and to think about how are they going to prepare themselves so that they can access and have accountability and engagement with a system that will help them to die in the way that they would like to. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the public health palliative care model in action. May the 4th was earlier this week, 2 days ago. It's COVID, I get confused with dates. And this is something that my palliative care team here in Northwestern Ontario put together in honor of May the 4th Day. And you can see here, we're still plugging this idea about talking about dying and death, about getting informed, thinking about advanced care planning. And, you know, Baby Yoda here says, young or old, it matters not. Advanced care planning we must do. Next, please.
So you, Kathy raised how important death literacy is, how important it is that we talk about death and dying. And as a sidebar, Kathy has like the best book title on the planet, Talking About Death Won't Kill You. And I'm part of a group that absolutely recognizes the importance of all of that work. But as she said, palliative care acknowledges that it hasn't done a very good job with grief. As a society, we haven't done a very good job of grief. And really, death literacy, while it is doing super important work in terms of increasing our ability to think about the end of life, to talk about death, to prepare for death, to prepare for the end of life, have advanced care planning, discussions. While all of that is incredibly important, it doesn't really get to grief. It doesn't really get to when I've had the conversations and the person that I love, or my child, or my parent, or my whoever has died, what now? And how do I, or my neighbor's person has died, or what, someone in my workplace has had someone die, or someone has experienced a huge loss, which, like in COVID, many of us are experiencing losses. So we come back to grief, and we come back to needing to talk about grief more. So as part of the public health movement, there has been research in Australia about a model of bereavement supports. Now, this comes out of the idea, the recognition, in fact, that in their palliative care system in Australia, essentially everyone who experienced a death was being referred to counseling. And their palliative care system is strong, and lots of people who are dying receive palliative care. I think their numbers are much better than ours here in Canada. And they recognize that not everybody could, the system couldn't actually provide professional counseling for everyone who is experiencing grief. And they didn't necessarily need that referral or that assistance or that professional assistance. So this group of researchers thought about what they thought would be needed in terms of bereavement support, and they theorized this model, and they theorized that only 10% of people would be at risk of what we deem to be more complicated grief that actually requires, not that it requires, but it really can benefit, people can really benefit from professional help. And that 30%, so what I'm referring to right now are the numbers that are in brackets there. So they theorized 10% and 30% and 60%. So they theorized that 30% would be at moderate risk, so might need some additional support, some peer support, some volunteer-led support, but not necessarily professional support. And that 60% would be at low risk of complicated grief, of grief that's more complex, grief that is where people are stuck, where people are veering into more problematic scenarios. So 60% would be at low risk, and they would, they would be dealing with their grief with the support of family and friends, their communities, the people around them. What's important about this model is that 100% of the people in the model benefit from the support of family and friends if they are getting it. And so they tested this model, and in fact, it was 6.4% that were at high risk of complicated grief, and slightly higher who were at moderate risk, and 58% who were at low risk. But they also asked them about the support that they were getting, and a lot of people were finding that the support that they were getting wasn't beneficial. Some people were reaching out for professional support and finding it not beneficial. So there's a lot of really good research about this, I come back to the idea that 100% of people can benefit from their family, their friends, their co-workers, their faith communities, their neighborhood associations, the people around them, being able to support them when they have experienced a loss of any kind, and that's the area that grief literacy comes into, is increasing that ability for that support. So I am extremely privileged to work with one of the people who worked on that model that was on your last screen. Lauren Brain was, she's an Australian psychologist who was part of that, the conception of that model. And I work with her in the guise of the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. We are the public health subgroup. And we spent a lot of time thinking about grief literacy, and published this paper on grief literacy and a call to action for compassionate communities. And it's trying to increase this idea that we need to solidify the more important work that's being done that Kathy described, and expand into greater grief literacy and talking about grief. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we as a group thought about. So the group, Lauren is Australian, Daisuke is Japanese, Karima and Mary Ellen are Canadian. Myself, David Roth is German, and Amy Chow is from Hong Kong. So we were a nice international group, and we did a lot of thinking about grief literacy, and I'm going to talk to you about some of those concepts. So first of all, we searched for a definition and didn't find it. So we spent a lot of time deciding on the definition ourselves. And we decided that it is an individual's capacity to access, process, and use knowledge regarding the experience of loss. You'll start to hear parallel pieces to what Kathy was saying earlier about death literacy. So we were, it is trying to kind of mirror that literacy aspect, but particularly this in particular to grief. We thought that it was a multidimensional concept. We wanted it. We thought about it comprising knowledge, so that people could understand and reflect on grief, and skills so that they could take action, and values that inspire compassion and care. And those dimensions connect and integrate because we recognize that individuals are interdependent and individuals are situated in sociocultural contexts. And we can think of lots of different examples of those kind of contexts. And that's what we were trying to get at in this definition. So beyond that, we thought about the types of loss. So we approached death literacy and decided that the best way to think about death literacy was to think about the question, how would we know if we were in a society that is grief literate? So how would we know if we were at our destination, if we were all grief literate, how would we know that? And we thought about some vignettes that I'm going to share with you, but in thinking about these vignettes, we were really keeping these aspects in mind in terms of the types of loss, because we wanted to make sure that we were talking about both death and non-death losses, and who is experiencing the loss in terms of the gender of the person, the age of the person, and their relationship to the person who died, if that's the kind of loss. So again, because we grieve, we grieve differently. We grieve our parents differently. Siblings grieve parents differently for various reasons. And a lot of that has to do with relationship, or what was lost. Was if a person had died, or a pet had died, or we had lost possessions, an identity, we had lost a job, a role, caregiving, all those kinds of things. Jobs come into this, all kinds of, again, that idea that any kind of loss, not just death loss, is important. When the death or loss occurred, so how long it had been, if there was caregiving, how long they had gone on for, and where it had occurred, where people were living, their surroundings, their relationship to other people, those kinds of aspects, and how the person had died. So types of loss or circumstances. So those are the things that we were keeping in mind. And then we developed vignettes. And as I said, we thought about the question, how would we know if we're grief literate? And we have this sort of ongoing joke about boarding the bus to utopia. So I'm asking you to join me in imagining utopia and imagining that we are in a grief literate society. And I am going to give you some vignettes of what that would look like. And so one example of a grief literate society is about Hassan. Hassan was forced to leave his dog while escaping from Syria during the Civil War. 5 years later, now living in Sydney, he meets Ida walking her dog. Ida notes Hassan's interest in her dog and invites him to tell his story. Ida recognizes Hassan's grief, invites him to walk the dog with her and teach her more about CERAH. So, here's a vignette where we're trying to touch on numerous kinds of loss and numerous kinds of support. And so, that Ida is not inviting Hassan to talk about what happened in Syria, but about Syria. And she, talks to him about the dog. So, acknowledging that animals can be, they can be the objects of loss, but they can also be really important ways of connecting with people. So there's a lot of levels, there's a lot of loss that happens when people leave countries. And there's a lot of levels of ways that we're trying to illustrate grief literacy in this example. Another example, Phyllis hires Bill, an Indigenous speaker, to address her class by telling his people's story, focusing on resilience, intergenerational grief, and trauma. The students appreciate hearing the personal side of what is already covered in their assigned textbook. So, we were very careful with, when we were doing these vignettes, we were very careful with every single word. We were very careful with Phyllis hiring Bill, so not inviting people to tell their stories for free. What I particularly love about this utopian view is that the students had already learned this, that these subjects were already in their textbook. That would be a really great society, and we're getting there. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. So that's the kinds of aspects that we were trying to focus on here, and making sure that we were touching on intergenerational grief and trauma, because those are so important and so much a part of the context for so many people. And part of what we need to understand when we're grief literate. So another example is about Carlos, who's 12 years old. With the anniversary of his twin brother's death approaching, his football teammates are more attentive to Carlos. They notice that, despite the heat, Carlos will only wear long sleeve jerseys. Worried that Carlos might be self-harming, the teammates approach the coach for advice. Again, we often don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about death or grief with children, but children experience loss, children experience death, and they experience grief. And it's really important that we prepare our children. So, in the introduction, there was a reference made to public education, and I would like to personally see public education and education in our school system about both death and grief. And so this example, is touching on both the aspect of children dying, because Carlos's twin brother has died, but also touching on the idea that we need to be aware of anniversaries, or death anniversaries as they're referred to, and that his teammates are aware of that. And so they go to a trusted adult for advice about the worry that maybe Carlos is self-harming. So, again, this is a utopian view of what we would be, of one aspect of living in a grief literate society. One final one that is from our published article is about Jen and Britta. Jen and Britta had just met at a barbecue. Jen asks Britta about her work, and Britta says she is a counselor who works with people bereaved by suicide. Britta is confident that disclosing her work will be met with an affirming response from Jen. Jen responds, "Oh, I've never done that. Tell me more." And I have to say that when as a group we presented this vignette to our colleagues at the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement, this got the biggest response from the other folks in the room, because they were all, they're all people who have worked for many of them decades in grief and loss and death and dying. And this kind of response is not automatic. This kind of response is unfortunately laughable. We don't often get this kind of response when we talk about the kind of work that we do. So it was met with laughter. So this is a really utopian view, but would be a really, really nice response to receive instead of that silence or people just walking away, which just, I think a number of us have happened. I can see Kathy nodding. So again, a utopian view. If we lived in a grief literate society, this is something that people who work in this area would be met with affirming responses. And then we all know that this happens. So our international group did some more thinking in terms of grief and COVID. We wrote this piece collectively, again, in the medium so that it's available to all. And I'm sure we can make available the link to folks after the fact as well. So I wanted to share just a few COVID related vignettes and one related to some of our research as well. So again, how would we know if we're grief literate? The country of Ireland recognized that the population needed a way to acknowledge grief in the pandemic. They launched a campaign to have everyone, hashtag, shine a light, be it a candle or a quartz light, to honor both healthcare workers and those who had died. Celebrities recorded songs and messages of support. The president also recorded a message to accompany fireworks in the capital city. So all of the other vignettes so far have been fictional, and this one is not. Ireland actually did this, and they had this massive campaign to shine a light. I don't know where it's at, but Ireland is doing some amazing work in terms of their grief literacy. They have also tested the Australian model that I showed you earlier in Ireland, and they have made some really great strides to acknowledge grief, especially in COVID. And one of the ways that they did that was the Shine a Light campaign. And the president really did record a message, and there really were fireworks in the capital city. And so this is, I think this is my favorite vignette because it's a real one. So, you know, some places are closer to grief literacy than we are. So now I'm going to merge into a little bit more of an idea of grief literacy that has to do with one of the research projects that is near and dear to my heart. Healthcare, if we were lived in a grief literate society, healthcare professionals would routinely ask all people if they had tattoos or were planning any. The professionals would ask people to tell their stories about their images. So this is a desire and a utopian view that comes out of a research project that a group of us did a number of years ago on memorial tattoos. So I'm just going to share a few of those examples with you. This is a tattoo that honors the wearer's brother and the family using this word as a salutation. This is a Dutch word for strength, and they would sort of offer to one another as a blessing, as a sort of sending off. So this is a memorial tattoo that is not obviously memorial, and so it would be really important to ask for the story behind it. It's an amazing, heartwarming story. These are two tattoos that both of which honor a stillborn child, and they are not. They're not obvious, and they're also not in obvious locations on the body. They are on the left-hand one is on the chest, and the right-hand one is on the side of the ribs. And they both honor a child who is stillborn, and the one on the right honors the siblings as well. Again, it's important to ask the stories behind tattoos because they're not necessarily obvious. And this last one is a signature It allows me, and what this young woman said, it allows me every day when I see it. It allows me to bring a smile to my face instead of feeling the loss and the pain. A lovely story that goes behind it. That her grandmother was at her wedding because her grandmother had died before she got married. So she designed her wedding dress so that the tattoo was visible, so that her grandmother was present with her. So, and just the planning, it's the healthcare professionals wouldn't necessarily know that if they didn't ask the question. And planning tattoos is also important to ask about because not everybody is able to get tattoos for financial reasons or for health reasons. And so sometimes we need to ask about tattoos that are planned rather than obtained already. So I'm going to pass it to Kathy to talk about what we're doing nationally.
Thanks, Susan. Next slide, please. So I'm hopeful that people will have heard at this point of the Canadian Grief Alliance. And this is a group of people, along with hundreds of organizations who have signed on to come together to highlight the needs of grief that Canadians are experiencing, both during COVID and beyond. So as both Susan and I have said, we've recognized that we have not done an excellent job in Canada supporting people who are actively grieving, from a grief literacy piece, from compassionate communities in terms of support, knowing how to support people, and also from a professional support piece. And so the Canadian Grief Alliance came together recognizing, as focused as we are right now as Canadians on vaccinations, you cannot vaccinate for grief. And so never in our lifetime has Canada experienced the volume and potentially the complexity of grief that has resulted from COVID-19. Next, please. And part of this is because of how people are dying and also our system's response, trying to be able to navigate COVID in a safe way, but recognizing that many people are dying in isolation without their family members, their friends, those who know them intimately at the bedside, being able to offer them some of that care, to be able to show their death literacy. And so we're seeing people who are anguished, who are actively grieving and have a sense of guilt and regret because they are not able to do what they think they should do or what they could do to support somebody at the end of their life. Next, please. So the Canadian Grief Alliance has been proposing a national grief strategy because in Canada, we presently do not have one. And we have just had a national palliative care strategy, of which grief is a tiny part of, but we're recognizing with this influx, with this experience of COVID, and recognizing, as Susan has said, that it's not always just grief related to death, but all the losses that I'm sure we could all make a massive list of right now if we thought about what we've experienced over the past year during COVID. So we are looking for opportunities to sustain and expand grief services. Both Susan and I have heard from our colleagues across the country not being able to reach capacity to support people, not being able to utilize some of the strategies that we have in terms of grief groups, needing to pivot and do things online. And so we recognize that while grief was underfunded during the pandemic, right now there is a growing demand and people are really struggling to keep up with that support, to know who to support, to be able to engage in those education pieces that are so direly needed at this point. So we're hoping and we're proposing to launch a public awareness campaign to increase our grief literacy as a country, to support people in developing healthy coping strategies, to recognize that grief is not mental health, and to be able to build the capacities of individuals and communities to support the grieving. And Susan and I are going to talk about some research that we are doing, but one of the things when we talk about this capacity is when I think about the casserole brigade that often happens after somebody has died, and that idea of showing support through food. And that disappeared for many people during COVID when we were scared initially and not sure about how the virus was transported. And so people weren't sure what to do. We often don't know what to say when somebody has died, but COVID has changed things. So we're not even sure, how do we support? How do we engage in that way? And so we're looking for some money to be able to build capacity, to be able to build a grief literacy strategy. Next, please. So what have we been doing? So it's a group of volunteers who think and know that grief is important and how we grieve matters. And so we've been engaging in old school advocacy and doing all sorts of letter and email writing to MPs and MPPs. And we've sat down with Patty Haidu and we've been advocating for all the different budgets, both provincially and nationally. And we've been doing this off the side of our desks, trying to make some noise, trying to get different people to pay attention. And we continue to be quite hopeful that this is happening. Next, please. So I think now we're going to highlight some of the research projects that Susan and I have been working on. Next, please.
So just briefly, so this image is about the article that we wrote about memorial tattoos with the team that I worked on with that. And we have a wonderful new project called Healing Tattoos, which is looking both at memorial tattoos and all kinds of other ways that tattoos help with healing and growth. That includes a large number of my esteemed colleagues in this area. So that's a study that one is sort of finished and one is just beginning, but include grief and conversations about grief, and we continue to move that forward. The other ongoing study in terms of analysis is about grief after MAID. As I'm sure you all know, MAID is relatively recent in Canada, and there's very little research about grief and whether or not it's the grief after an assisted death is different from any other. So I'm working with David Wright and Marjorie Montreuil and Mary Ellen McDonald, with a shout out to Lisa Chan, who's been an important support as well. We've been interviewing folks about their grief after an assisted death. And we have a few preliminary results, and one of which is that timing is just so important, and the time that one spends when one knows the date of death is hugely important. One of the reasons we wanted to do this research was to find out if grief after an assisted death is different, is more difficult. And in some ways, in our early interviews, it actually seems like it was in some ways easier because people felt so privileged to have spent quality time with the person who was dying before they died. We were a bit concerned that our sample was that we were missing something, and we did some additional interviews and we found some people who are having a little bit more difficulty, but are still huge proponents of the access to MAID and how important it is. So that's research that the analysis has just begun, I'm sure we'll come back and talk to Dying with Dignity when we have more results. And I'm not going to do much more than mention that we're doing this research, but because Kathy's going to talk about sort of the Northern Ontario arm, but we're doing Kitchener-Waterloo-based, Waterloo County-based, or Waterloo region-based interviews in terms of saying goodbye in the context of the pandemic. have not even begun to analyze the data. But Kathy is farther along. It's, you know, it's a project that we are doing off the sides of our desk. And Kathy is farther along in the Northern Ontario arm, so she's going to share some of those results and along with some of her other research. So I'll pass it back to you, Kathy.
I just wanted to highlight a death literacy project. Can you go backwards for me, Susan? That we're doing in Northwestern Ontario. It's a community engaged research project where we were looking at what kind of death literacy rates do we actually have in the Northwest. And so we employed the Death Literacy Index developed by our colleagues in Western Sydney University and administered it across the Northwest. And we have a few hundred responses to our surveys, which we're using to then guide the different educational initiatives that Hospice Northwest, our Northwest Palliative Care Regional Program, and the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health deliver to support and grow the capacity of our communities. Our second phase involved actually getting out there in the communities and talking with people. And we did 2 different initiatives. We did 9 book chats across the region where we asked groups of people to come together organically. They could be book clubs, they could be families, they could be work groups who would read a book on dying and death, and then we'd created a discussion guide and we engaged in that conversation. And again, relevant for this presentation is that we heard a lot of people talking about not sure what to do around grief during COVID. And the other phase with that is we're calling it a Dialogues in a Box, which Dialogues is an initiative out of Hospice Northwest in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which involves getting communities together to engage in death literacy, to talk about dying and death and what they need to know. And so we're doing these now online for smaller groups and getting people together to engage in those discussions, but also to think about how they can apply that learning that occurs within the Zoom time out into the community as they learn how to increase their capacity to care for each other at the end of life. Next slide, please. And so the study that Susan was alluding to, because COVID brings people together, and it was lovely to be able to connect with Susan in this way, wondering, you know, when COVID hit, how can we contribute? You know, we're all staying at home, and as academics, we want to learn more. And Dr. Kevin Bazanzin, who is a palliative care physician here in Thunder Bay, had approached me, and we were talking about some of the things that he was witnessing in the hospitals and in terms of visitor restrictions and how people were dying. And so in discussion with Susan, we thought, let's get some of these stories out there. And so that is what we've been striving to do. And I believe one of our research assistants, Carolyn Durant, who's a PhD student at Lakehead, is on this call, and she's been part of gathering this data. And so thus far in Thunder Bay, or in Northwestern Ontario, excuse me, we've interviewed 24 people who've experienced the death of somebody since COVID started. And we are still in the early analysis phases as well. But I wanted to share a little bit about what we are hearing from people. So next slide, please, Susan. So of course, this won't be a surprise to anybody, this idea of not being allowed to visit. And one of our participants was a heart-wrenching story early on in COVID. She said she just had to go see her loved one. And so she put the ladder in the back of her husband's truck, and her kids were mortified. Oh my God, you're not, but she did. And we've heard these stories out in the news where people used ladders, climbed over walls to be able to connect to their loved ones who were in institutions as they were dying. And it's not just the family members who are feeling that pain. And we know that we want to acknowledge that healthcare providers as well. And one of the reasons I like this quote is that the participant in our study acknowledged that there was a nurse who pushed the bed closer to the window so that they could have that kind of connection. And the participant sat outside that window for hours. She even talks about being in the bushes, but needing to have that connection. Next slide, please. And we also recognize that the regulations and the rules that people had to follow have changed and fluctuated drastically throughout COVID. And they also, of course, changed provincially and regionally. And that's part of the reason why we've extended the study to the Waterloo region as well. And so you hear that people don't necessarily blame the healthcare providers. They understand that it's COVID, that it's top down, but it's still harmful and they are still hurting. Next, please. And of course, we know in grief work that contact with people is really important. And it's contact both before somebody has died and after they've died, and then it's maintaining that connection. One of my favorite quotes is from Thomas Addick, who talks about the work of grief being moving from loving in presence to loving in absence. So we're not getting over the person who has died, we're figuring out a new way to maintain a relationship. And so when we talk about the death system, we need to think about all those different factors that are involved. And so a funeral director can play a really important part. And this is a quote from a participant who didn't have the opportunity to physically be present when the family member died, but utilize a relationship with the funeral director so that she could still have physical touch after the death. Because of COVID, she was unable to do that ahead of time. Next, please. And then, of course, there's a whole PPE factor, which we recognize does not show people's faces. We communicate so much with how we utilize our face as part of that. And we hear people who have been told that, yes, they could be in the room with the person who was dying, but they weren't allowed to touch them and they had to be fully garbed in the PPE. And some people will say that being present and in PPE in the same room and not being allowed to touch someone as they were dying has been more painful than if they weren't present. Next slide, please. We've also heard that planning for after death rituals has become incredibly challenging for people. Again, when we think about our grief literacy, we recognize that we do some things because that's how we've always done them. We seem to be a little bit formulaic. After 3 days after a death, we talk about a funeral, even though we know, and Susan will attest to this, I'm sure as well, that takes a lot longer than 3 days for grief to kick in, for people to begin to take that message from the head to the heart and understand what it means. But we kind of move in that way. So what's happening in COVID now when people can't have funerals, or if they're having funerals, it's with a very small number of people, as this quote talks about, having a couple of families coming together and already you're over the allotted number of people. And then if you want to invite a religious figure to be part of that celebration of life, who stays home? Next slide, please. And we've also heard that some people are getting creative. I've heard some stories about how the night that somebody was actively dying at home, a community came together and they organized a drive-by, just as I'm sure as you were seeing for birthdays, but this was a drive-by for the community, for the family who had taken their loved one into their home so that that was where this person could die. And the community, at a loss for what to do, said, you know what, we're doing it for birthdays, let's do this drive-by as part of our show of support for the person who was dying. And so people are getting creative. We're seeing things, funerals done as YouTube videos where people record them. We are seeing Zoom funerals as well, as people are trying to get there. And this quote here highlights that, you know what, as much as this family really struggled with the idea of creating a YouTube video, they had over 500 views, which was way more people that might have shown up for a funeral in a non-COVID time. Next, please. And again, people thinking about how to use the technology. And it's interesting now, I think with Zoom fatigue hitting for many of us, I wonder how many people will still maintain this kind of connection and what will be the next way that we make funerals or after death rituals happen. Next, please. And then we're of course hearing lots of stories of grief and people naming their grief and what it looks like for them. And this first quote here I found was quite powerful. And the participant said, I feel grief because people died alone. I've been with many people as they died, and it's not a scary thing, but what they need to know that they're surrounded by love. And that's what COVID has done. The COVID restrictions have stolen their right to be surrounded by people who love them. And of course, people are talking about postponing their after death rituals. And sometimes that translates for people as a postponement of their grief. And so they're holding off the after death rituals that bring that sense of support, that allow for social mourning, that bring that connection with the larger community. And often people will talk about that they're waiting for that to happen before they're actively grieving. Next slide, please. And of course, there are some people who are finding that because of COVID, because of the strict restrictions here in Ontario right now, we are under stay-at-home orders. And so people are finding that when they're not able to do some of those regular tasks, such as organize a funeral, make sure all the family members are there, that it's actually a moment for them to sit and reflect and begin to do their own grief work. And so some people are finding that that reflection, that isolation allows them to engage in deeper grief experiences than if they were engaged in some of those other things that often happen after death. Next, please.
So this is a shot of the New York Times cover piece on Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, writing about the losses that we share. So she wrote a piece after she experienced a miscarriage, and I think it's an important reminder of what both Kathy and I are trying to get at, is that we all need to talk more about the losses that we share. We do share a lot of losses, be we royalty or not, and especially in COVID, we are sharing more and more, and that which doesn't mean that we're sharing them all in the same way. I'm not saying that we're all in the same boat either. One of the most powerful quotes for me is about, we might all be in the same ocean, but some of us are on rafts and some of us are in ocean liners and everything in between. It's not that our circumstances are the same, but we all share losses. We all experience loss. And I particularly like the idea that the path to healing begins with 3 simple words: are you okay? Because that for me illustrates that we need to reach out to one another. We need to acknowledge grief. We need to not ignore grief. We need to not ignore the people who are grieving. And that also requires that we acknowledge it in ourselves, and so that we can reach out to others. And that knowledge of self and self-compassion is what allows compassion for others. So I think this is, for me, emblematic of, again, that we're moving in the right direction, that we are on the path to that grief literate society that I so long for, and that utopian view that I invited you to share with me a little while ago. So this is one example of that.
So one of the ways that the Canadian Grief Alliance is hoping to get us to pay attention to grief is to acknowledge the numbers of Canadians who are grieving. And so this is the COVID-19 grief counter that you can find on the webpage of the Canadian Grief Alliance. And this is the number from a couple of days ago. And so it's not the number of deaths that there have been in Canada, but it's the number of people who are grieving presently in Canada. And it recognizes from a study at Pennsylvania State University that the death of one person generally impacts around 9 other people. And so these are the numbers that we are seeing. And so hopefully when we acknowledge the numbers, when we recognize the depth of people that are experiencing grief, that we will be able to step up as individuals to ask people, are you okay? To be able to step up in our roles as educators and healthcare providers to be able to ask those questions when we see people, to be able to step up in our role in community and think of creative ways to support people during COVID, and to also step up and demand of our governments, of our healthcare systems, of our social systems, and let them know that grief matters and you can't vaccinate for grief. And so in closing, next slide, please, Susan, I just wanted to end with a quote from Paul Adams, who is part of our team at the Canadian Grief Alliance, who says that this is a hidden tragedy in the current crisis, but one that will also have long-term implications for many individual Canadians, as well as our healthcare systems and the economy. Many people are now facing the deaths of loved ones, isolated from networks of family and friends that normally help people get through such heart-wrenching moments in their lives. Unless we step up and help people now, we will be dealing with a human toll for many years to come. And so this is a call for us all to go and increase our grief literacy. And I want to say thank you very much to Dying with Dignity for inviting us to speak today. And I'm hoping that we have left some time for questions.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. Both of you just addressed those topics with so much care, and yeah, we're so grateful for sharing all of your knowledge. So I am mindful of time. We probably have time for maybe 2 questions. And so if anyone else has any more questions that we don't cover, please feel free to email support@dyingwithdignity.ca. Okay, so let's see here. There were a few good ones that came in. So Susan, you touched early on that grief is not always related to the death of a person or a pet or whatnot. So some people were wondering if there were any resources you could suggest related to supporting someone who's going through a non-death related grief situation, and also any similarities and differences related to those experiences. So similarities and differences of going through a death of a person or pet versus maybe a situation, perhaps.
That's a good question. And, I think on one level, grief is grief. And, when we are better at acknowledging it and understanding, I think we can be more inclusive in our understanding of it. Now, of course, it's for instance, very different to grieve the loss of a marriage, for instance, than it is when a spouse dies. So death and divorce, for instance, as 2 different kinds of losses, are going to have different aspects, but that, I think the core of grieving and, needing to understand that model in terms of we orient ourselves to the loss and we orient ourselves to restoration, that holds for whatever the kind of loss is. And, we sort of bombard ourselves with the knowledge that we've experienced this, and then we protect ourselves from it sometimes. So that, those are the kinds of similarities. So I think any kind of resource that acknowledges grief, and my go-to is through Canadian Virtual Hospice. They are the drivers behind the Grief Alliance. They have a resource called mygrief.ca, kidsgrief.ca. They have resources for paramedics. They are just momentarily launching resources for Two-Spirit, lesbian, queer, transgender, LGBTQ folks. They have, Living My Culture. They have all kinds of different resources. So virtualhospice.ca is, for me, the go-to place. And the other resource that I think about is Megan Devine in the US, who has made this great little video about how to support a grieving friend. And essentially, it's about not trying to cheer people up. We too often are seeking to cheer people up and sort of jolly them out of the feelings that they have. And regardless of what the loss is, be it a death loss or a non-death loss, we need to be able to sit with people's feelings and not try to jolly them out of it. So that's another resource that I think of. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Kathy.
No, I, of course, was going to say the virtual hospice piece as well, who also is, I think, along with Dying with Dignity, have some tools specifically for MAID as well. I also really appreciate Robert Niemeyer's work, a psychologist out of the US as well, who talks about the meaning-making work within grief. And so he writes quite well about grief in general, so not necessarily always death-related, but really focuses on this idea that we actively grieve based on the meaning that we attribute to the event or the loss. And so I think that that's a really poignant way to consider grief and loss as well.
Thank you. And actually, you covered a couple questions in that answer, both of you. So that's really wonderful. And I guess just one quick one to wrap it up before we end this session. So you were talking about sort of situating death within the community where most of us spend our time, Kathy. And so someone was wondering about, you know, how maybe death doulas, for example, can help with bringing in a new, less clinical perspective for folks who are grieving, or, you know, for folks who are supporting those who are grieving.
I think that that's been an exciting advancement. And I would say that that speaks to how we are working towards increasing death and grief literacy in our communities. And so death doulas, I think, just like doulas at birth, have a really important role. They develop relationships with people at a deeper level and can help and support them in a way that they're not clinical professionals in doing so. They're able to engage in different ways. And I also would do a plug for hospices throughout the country as well, many of who have volunteers. And so again, people with knowledge and literacy and death and grief out there to be able to create relationships, supportive relationships with people that maybe don't have the baggage that we have sometimes with our family members or our friends, and so can become that person that can help and support you as you develop your learning and your capacity for dying and death. Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to build on that and add a shout out to the MAID hospice that's happening in Toronto, and there may be others in the works in the country, but I'm only aware of the one in Toronto. But again, that bringing death and dying and grief and loss into the community, and that normalization of it is hospices and death doulas are a huge part of that.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I took a lot of notes myself. So I'm really grateful for this. And for folks who are asking, we will be sending a few of these resources and some of the links as we have just been discussing in the recording. So you'll have access to that if you are interested in those resources. Again, we just want to thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today, sharing your knowledge, research, and perspectives. And again, everyone, please feel free to email us, support@dyingwithdignity.ca, for any other questions you might have. Our next session is taking place on Monday, May 10th at 3:00 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic will be grief and MAID, medical assistance in dying. So if you're interested, please be sure to register using the link in the chat, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.